I don't even really know what to say. There is no scientific, ethical, or moral justification for the horrors inflicted on women like Berta and the others who were subjected to these medical experiments. I mean, there's no way to defend that. Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff. Disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. Okay. I've got yet another example of unethical medical experiments on people. Similarly to the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, the Guatemala syphilis experiment is a story about using humans as guinea pigs to test their theories on sexually transmitted infections. But unlike with Tuskegee, where the patients already had syphilis and just weren't told or treated, in this case, the American government purposefully infected Guatemalans with syphilis. From 1946 to 1948, the U.S. government conducted medical experiments in Guatemala. Over 5,000 Guatemalans were part of this study, and a quarter of them were purposefully infected with bacteria like the one that causes syphilis, which, if left untreated, can kill. So in today's episode, we need to talk about this. First, the historical context, which you may know by now is my favorite part of doing history. Historical context helps us understand the why. Why was the U.S. conducting experiments on people? Why were they doing it in Guatemala? Why syphilis? And why 1946 to 1948? There needs to be a reason for the time and place, so we'll dive into the history to get a good sense of what was going on there. And after we've sorted through that, we'll have a brief lesson on syphilis and what it can do to the body. I've covered that in at least 2 episodes, most obviously in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, but just in case you didn't catch that one or if you need a refresher, we'll talk diseases for a little bit. And then, once we know why the story takes place in Guatemala and what syphilis can do to the body, we'll take a look at the event in question. And I really, really hope that I run out of episodes like these. It is disconcerting, to say the least, that there are so many episodes I can write on the U.S. experimenting on people with or without informed consent. We've done the Minnesota starvation experiment, Tuskegee. I just did an episode on the Holmesburg prison experiments, and now we're heading south to Central America. And I know that there are more stories. I just wish there weren't. Also, quick shout out to my newest cannibal patron, Sarah B. Sarah, thank you so much for being a cannibal and a supporter. It's because of amazing, beautiful people like you that I can continue to do this show, sharing gross and unpopular stories to help more people fall in love with history. So, thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. So let's get started. So first, before we talk about what we did in Guatemala, we need to answer why Guatemala? And the answer involves dictatorships, the Guatemalan Revolution, and U.S. intervention in Latin America. But first, we actually need to talk about bananas. Yes, the fruit. The United Fruit Company was founded in 1899 to grow and market bananas, a fruit that had been growing in popularity throughout the 19th century, that's the 1800s. And did you know that bananas are berries? So, there's a fun fact for you. You know it's not a berry? The strawberry. Now, bananas need a humid, tropical climate to grow, but more than that, they need a consistently warm temperature. So, typically, bananas are grown in the tropical regions of the world, Central and South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And yes, with modern technology, bananas can now also be grown in the US, but in limited production. I think I read California and Hawaii, and even like a small little area of Texas. It's kind of weird. I'll also mention real quick that perhaps our most humid state, Florida, where you might expect maybe bananas can grow, got snow this year, at least in the Panhandle. So not a warm, humid, consistent temperature. Anyways, bananas were growing in popularity, and to capitalize on this, the United Fruit Company set up plantations in Latin America. Guatemala was ripe for banana plantations. I had to, I'm sorry. It had the perfect growing conditions, but more than that, it was economically underdeveloped. Most Latin American countries gained their independence in the early to mid 19th century, again that's the 1800s, after centuries of colonization at the hands of Europeans, mainly the Spanish and Portuguese. They certainly weren't the first to fight for their freedom during this age of revolutions. The American Revolution came first, and then the French, and then the Haitians. So there were certainly examples to help guide those in Latin America who no longer wanted to be controlled by volatile European monarchs and their politics. Creoles led many of these revolutions, those of European descent, but born in the New World. Men like Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and Miguel Hidalgo argued that they should be in control of their respective countries and regions. They wanted political power and autonomy, much like their northern neighbors in the United States. I mean, to be fair, not all of those guys immediately wanted to rule, but they were fighting on behalf of the Creoles and then secondarily of the people. And with that power, they hoped to experience an economic boom, to be able to compete on the international market like the United States did after their revolution. But it didn't happen that way. Instead, there was widespread economic stagnation. Now, there have been a lot of theories as to why it worked for post-revolutionary United States, but not for most Latin American nations. One of the more notable theories was the dependency theory, developed by Raúl Prebisch in the 50s. Prebisch was an Argentinian economist who served as the director of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America. His argument went back to the days of European colonialism. Centuries of mercantilism meant that Latin American countries never profited from trade. They would sell their raw materials to the Western world, who then sold them back to Latin Americans as manufactured goods, but at a higher price than what they sold the initial materials for. So this meant two things. One, Latin American economies would never profit, and two, their economic growth was dependent on foreign markets. And when they gained their independence, it didn't really change too much. Now, dependency theory was actually a response to the earlier argument for why Latin American economies didn't perform the same as Western ones, and that was the modernization theory. Essentially, the argument was that all countries follow the same trajectory from traditionalism to modernity, and that the US just happened to be further along on this scale on their journey than Latin American countries. But this theory is really outdated, as it assumes that all countries are on the same path to becoming like Western Europe. So they were judged based on how Western European nations progressed. Prebisch argued that the goal wasn't to become a clone of Western Europe. It was to become self-sufficient, which looks different in different cultures. Not everybody is going to become a Western European country, nor do they want to. And they couldn't become self-sufficient because international markets made them dependent. So that scale doesn't work, right? So dependency theory was kind of a rebuttal to modernization theory. Now, dependency theory has its critics as well. It doesn't really hold up to the complexities of the 21st century economic world or e-business, and it overly simplifies the argument into just the external factors impacting Latin American growth. Doesn't really deal too much with internal factors or things going on at home. But at least it gives us a window into understanding how colonialism impacted the economies of Latin America, even post-revolution. And this is also very true of Guatemala. Now, Guatemala's economy in the late 19th, early 20th centuries was built around agriculture. Their three largest exports were coffee, sugar, and bananas, all things grown in stable, tropical climates. Guatemala's economy depended on them, and the Americans, eager to get their hands on more bananas, helped fuel that market. But here's where things go south. The United Fruit Company didn't just want to purchase bananas from Guatemala and sell them for profit. They wanted to control all aspects of the business, from the land on which the banana trees were planted to the railroads used to bring the bananas to ports. The United Fruit Company owned large swaths of Guatemala, and they had a vested interest in maintaining control over their lands. And this is part of a broader pattern of U.S. interventionism in Latin America. It wasn't just businesses, though. The U.S. government was also interested in maintaining control over places like Guatemala. And this is where we get the term banana republics, not the store. It was a term given to countries whose economies depended on a single produce exports. It's named after bananas, right? And who were usually controlled by foreign-owned businesses like the United Fruit Company. Although, to be fair, Guatemala did also export coffee and sugar, not just bananas. But the US definitely controlled the political and economic situation in Guatemala through the banana industry. To make sure that American businesses maintained this control, the US supported governments that aligned with their interests. And in this case, those governments were either strong right-wing leaders, military juntas, or authoritarian dictatorships. And I'll say that again, the US supported dictatorships in Latin American countries like Guatemala so they could keep their business interests intact. This is a fact. We fought against dictatorships in World War II, but then supported them in Latin America during the Cold War. And speaking of Cold War, there is another factor here that's important to the conversation: communism. The spread of communism in the post-World War II world was a massive concern. There was a rise in socialist and communist ideals and principles in Latin America because there was, and still is, massive inequality between the ruling elite and everyone else. This all stems back to the caste system, the Sociedad de las Castas, put in place by Spanish and Portuguese colonial authorities, but that is a story for another day. Now, in addition to supporting their business interests, the US also wanted to contain the spread of communism. Truman Doctrine, right? Containment. And it wasn't just a theoretical. Remember that the Communist Revolution did eventually topple Cuba in 1959. But we're in the 40s, right? So to try to prevent the spread of communism and to support their business interests in Guatemala, the US supported the Guatemalan dictator Jorge Ubico, who ruled Guatemala from 1931 to 1944. Here are some highlights of his tenure. Lowlights? They're not good. Highlights sounds like the wrong word. Ubico allowed the United Fruit Company to own or lease millions of acres of Guatemalan land and gave them big tax exemptions. In fact, the United Fruit Company owned 42% of Guatemala's land, and 77% of all of their exports went to the United States. And in return for this power and control, the US provided financial and military support for the Ubico regime. With this support, Ubico built a police state, and rebellions were met with violence, particularly against peasants and the indigenous. Ubico, in his own words, once said, quote, "I am like Hitler, I execute first and ask questions later." End quote. And I think that says enough about what you need to know about Ubico. The US supported him because he supported our business interests there. Or as the Zinn Education Project notes, quote, "The US government simply ignored it so long as US investment in the country flourished." End quote. In 1944, 2 years before the Guatemala syphilis experiments began, his regime was toppled by the Guatemalan Revolution, as people were very tired of his authoritarian regime. And though for a while there were open democratic elections, there was still a lot of political instability and major economic concerns. What would happen to the US's control of Guatemalan lands under a new government that wasn't as favorable to businesses like the United Fruit Company? Eventually, 1954, a US-backed coup deposed the Guatemalan president and put another dictator in power. It caused 4 decades of civil war in Guatemala, and some of the men who were militarily, financially, and politically supported by the US then went on to massacre the indigenous Maya peoples, an event known as the Guatemalan Genocide, and that is also a story for another day. I think I might be doing it this year. Or maybe I'm doing the Argentinian Dirty War. I don't know. I'll get there. And it was during this period of intense political instability, economic uncertainty, and the intervention that the US government conducted syphilis experiments on thousands of Guatemalans from 1946 to 1948. So before we talk about the event in question, let's briefly go over syphilis and why it is so incredibly dangerous and immoral for the US to have purposefully infected people with it. Syphilis is a bacterial infection, and most infections are sexually transmitted. And if you get syphilis, it can sometimes hang out in your body for years without you knowing about it, because not everyone who contracts syphilis is symptomatic, which is true of most diseases. But regardless, if left untreated, it can do some serious damage to your heart, brain, liver, bones. It can kill you. All right, it can kill you. There are 4 stages of syphilis: primary, secondary, latent, and tertiary. In the primary stage, you'll see small sores pop up around the site of infection, and they are called chancres. They are normally painless, can appear alone or in multiples, and surface 3 or so weeks after initial contact. And as I said in my Tuskegee episode, because the bumps are usually painless, you may not even know you have it. And you might think to yourself, I would know if I had a random new lump on my body. And my PG answer to that question is that the bumps usually appear where you contract the infection, and that could be in places that you can't see, so you may not even know that you have them. Now, after 3 to 6 weeks, the lumps heal, they're gone. The secondary stage presents as a rash, normally. Sometimes it happens alongside the chancres from the primary stage, sometimes weeks after healing. It's not normally itchy and may be kind of faint, so you may not even see it. You'll likely also experience the normal things that your body does when it deals with an infection: muscle aches, fever, sore throat, fatigue, weight loss, enlarged lymph nodes, right? The usual stuff. For some, these symptoms will go away on their own. For the unlucky ones, they'll come and go, on and off, for years. Now, if you haven't been treated, then the infection can progress to latent syphilis. This is when the bacteria goes into hiding, where it can sit dormant for years in your body. If you're lucky, it will never reawaken from its dormant state. But about 30 to 40% of those in the latent stage will develop complications, which is also the tertiary stage, sometimes also called late syphilis. And this is the stage that can cause serious harm or death. The infection at this stage essentially ravages your insides. It can damage your brain, your nerves, your eyes, your heart, blood vessels, liver, bones, joints, so like a good chunk of your internal system. And this could happen right away, or years, or sometimes even decades after the initial infection. Any of these complications can lead to death. Can syphilis be treated? Yes, of course, in the modern age. It's a bacterial infection, and we live in the age of antibiotics, thanks to Alexander Fleming and his petri dish full of penicillium mold spores. If you catch it early enough, you can kill the bacteria causing the syphilis infection. You're good to go. But hey, listen, PSA. I'm still an educator even though I left the classroom, so let me remind everyone that you cannot cure a viral infection with antibiotics. Antibiotics only cure bacterial infections, not viruses. Now, there might be antiviral medicines you can take to cure or prevent viruses from wreaking havoc in your body, but most of the time, you just need to wait for your body to take out a virus on its own. And some viruses, like herpes, set up a nice, cozy little home in your body and never leave. So, be safe out there. So this bacterial infection, studied in black men in Tuskegee from 1932 to 1972, was purposefully given to Guatemalans in 1946. Let's find out why. In 1946, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, funded a study to see what would happen if we put syphilis into human bodies. Why? Where did this idea come from? Now, the U.S. government, in the years after World War I, was concerned with sexually transmitted infections, or STIs. In 1938, Surgeon General Thomas Perrin went before Congress in support of funding for research into STIs, arguing for, quote, studies, investigations, and demonstrations which are necessary to develop more effective measures of prevention, treatment, and control of venereal diseases, so that science will give us a much more effective method of treatment than we now have. End quote. Okay, that sounds good, but what would that entail? Infections were on the rise during and after World War II, so there was a need for better care and research into ways to prevent and cure STIs. And even though this story does end up in Guatemala, initially, this research was to be conducted at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Planning began in 1942, and the idea was to intentionally infect prisoners with gonorrhea, which would be, quote, not only desirable but necessary in the study of many of the problems of war medicine which confront us, end quote. The idea was to find volunteers to be infected with gonorrhea. God, even saying that out loud sounds ridiculous. And then they would be trialed with different things to treat it, both before and after infection. Sulfonamide compounds taken by mouth before, and then chemicals applied locally to the genital tract after. And in case you were wondering, how? Because, in case you were wondering, they would be exposed to gonorrhea by applying the bacteria directly to the end of the member. Just take a little Q-tip and dab it right there at the end. Yikes. But not everyone in the planning stage agreed with this. What are the morals and ethics of intentionally exposing humans to STIs? What about the legal implications? There were a lot of reasons for choosing prison inmates for this, like constant supervision and access to medical care. The proposal was approved, and it looked like Terre Haute would be the place because it had better medical facilities than other penitentiaries. And it fell to the Public Health Service to conduct it, right? So, government survey here. The experiments happened between 1943 and 1944 and involved 241 prisoners. But shortly after it began, researchers faced challenges. They were not able to consistently infect the volunteers, which is a problem for an experiment where you need to have consistent variables. There were questions about abandoning the product, but the National Research Council, the ones overseeing those, the Public Health Service, countered that, quote, the opportunity for a study of experimental gonococcal infection in human volunteers and its relationship to the chemical prophylaxis of gonorrhea has never previously arisen on the present scale, and with the termination of this experiment, it is unlikely to arise again unless under the impetus of a future war. End quote. But despite this, the project ended in July 1944 after one of the lead researchers, Dr. Mahoney, decided to stop since they wouldn't reliably induce an infection. He noted that, quote, in spite of the use of different strains of Neisseria gonorrhea, modifications in methods of cultivating the organism, and of inoculation, it was found impossible to infect with a degree of regularity which would be required in the testing of prophylactic agents. End quote. So that experiment was a failure, but there were still unanswered questions about which prophylaxes could prevent STIs. And towards the tail end of the Terre Haute experiments, researchers were planning another set of human experiments, but this time in Guatemala. So first, why Guatemala? Dr. Mahoney, the same one who stopped working on the Terre Haute experiments, noted in the Journal of Venereal Disease Information in July 1947 that, quote, it has been considered impractical to work out, under post-war conditions in the United States, the solution of certain phases concerned with the prevention and treatment of syphilis. These problems are largely concerned with the development of an effective prophylactic agent for both gonorrhea and syphilis, and the prolonged observation of patients treated with penicillin for early syphilis. Because of the relatively fixed character of the population, and because of the highly cooperative attitude of the officials, both civil and military, an experimental laboratory in Guatemala City has been established. End quote. Okay, got it. It's because the US government had such a good relationship with Guatemala's dictators in the past and already owned a decent chunk of the lands there. This was true of several authoritarian governments in Central America, though, so why Guatemala specifically? Well, according to the brief, the doctors involved, including Dr. Mahoney, worked with a Guatemalan physician named Dr. Juan Funes, who had experience in a clinic where sex workers were required to get testing and medical inspections. So Funes was the link, and he recommended doing this test in his home country. Mahoney and others, including Dr. John Cutler, saw the potential for carefully controlled studies. Similarly to Terre Haute, the doctors planned to study the STIs at the Penitenciaria Central, where, quote, exposure of volunteers to infected prostitutes would provide the testing opportunities, end quote. This initial idea was to have prisoners couple with infected prostitutes. They hoped that this normal exposure would yield better results than what they tried to do at Terre Haute, applying bacterial gonorrhea samples directly to the tip. But the prisoners had no idea that the sex workers were infected. Once infected, the plan was to study different medications to see how effective they were in preventing symptoms from emerging or possibly in curing the infections. The main two substances were the antibiotic penicillin and salvarsan, which is the name brand for another drug. It's the first drug used to treat syphilis, but it was derived from arsenic, so it was pretty toxic and had some bad side effects. Now, the project proposal was approved by Surgeon General Thomas Parran, and they got funding to begin testing on volunteer inmates, but the scope ended up being much, much larger than just the prison. More than 5,500 prisoners, sex workers, soldiers, leprosy patients, psychiatric patients, and children were studied. About 1/4 of them, so 1,308, were intentionally infected with either syphilis, gonorrhea, or chancroid. Chancroid is another STI that causes painful ulcers on or near infection sites. Very contagious, curable with antibiotics. And all of those intentionally infected did not give informed consent. Some of them didn't even know they were infected. I'm going to hone in on that one more time. 1,308 people, 1,308 people were intentionally affected, and their ages ranged from 10 to 72. 10 years old. And many of these subjects were indigenous Guatemalans, the Mayans, or those living in poverty. And I'm saying Mayans, there are a lot of different Mayan groups, I understand that, I'm just trying to simplify. Now, exposure didn't just happen in the normal way. I'm not going to get too specific here, but in some cases, the patients would be injected with the bacteria directly, or they orally ingested it. But in most cases, it was in one way or another done through sexual contact, as it is a sexually transmitted infection. But with some patients, like the psychiatric patients, they would directly inoculate through the urethra, rectum, or eyes. You heard me right. Syphilis, straight to the eyeballs. Here's an example from the brief. I'll talk about the brief in a minute, but I'm going to warn you in advance. It's really shocking. Quote, Berta was a female patient in the psychiatric hospital. Her age and the illness that brought her to the hospital are unknown. In February 1948, Berta was injected in her left arm with syphilis. A month later, she developed scabies. Several weeks later, Dr. Cutler noted that she had also developed red bumps where he had injected her arms, lesions on her arms and legs, and her skin was beginning to waste away from her body. Berta was not treated for syphilis until 3 months after her injection, and soon after, on August 23rd, Dr. Cutler wrote that Berta appeared as if she was going to die, but he did not specify why. That same day, he put gonorrheal pus from another male subject into both of Berta's eyes, as well as in her urethra and rectum. He also reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, Berta's eyes were filled with pus from the gonorrhea, and she was bleeding from her urethra, and on August 27th, Berta died. End quote. I don't even really know what to say. There is no scientific, ethical, or moral justification for the horrors inflicted on women like Berta and the others who were subjected to these medical experiments. I mean, there's no way to defend that. Nothing about that is scientific. Those not intentionally infected, but still a part of the study, underwent serology testing, the collection of bloods and spinal fluids to detect infections. This part of the experiment lasted until 1953, longer than the purposeful infections that ended in 1948. Did they give treatment to those who they infected? Some of them, yes. Dr. Cutler, as a measure of goodwill, set up a treatment program at the behest of the Guatemalan military, and around 820 subjects got in treatment for their infections. But according to researchers, around 650 of those infections were part of the group who were purposefully exposed to it in the first place. And since I'm already really angry about this, let's just put out there that the whole point of this study was to find a place where they could get better rates of infection, right? Since that was the whole problem with Terre Haute. They weren't able to reliably get people infected, so you can't study it if you can't get infections. Well, that was still a problem in Guatemala. They didn't fix that problem. And I can't get over the fact that the US government funded an experiment where infected sex workers were sent into prisons to infect prisoners. We paid for this. Just let that sink in. We paid for this without knowing. Well, what I mean by that is the government knew, the NIH knew, we the people did not. The study ended in 1948. The results were never published. 83 people died during the course of these experiments, but it's not clear how or if it was from the infection, so we can't conclusively say one way or another if we killed 83 Guatemalans with our unethical, immoral, scientific study. Dr. Mahoney was the main supervisor of the experiments. He later became the chairman of the World Health Organization in 1948 and then the commissioner of the New York City Department of Health. He died in 1957. Surgeon General Thomas Perrin knew what was happening. He once said to Cutler, quote, we couldn't do such an experiment in this country, the United States, end quote. So that tells us everything we need to know about his involvement. He knew what was happening. And after serving as Surgeon General, he went on to work as the Dean of the School of Public Health at Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh. And after his death, a building was named after him, Perrin Hall. Though it has been renamed as of 2018 after all of his involvement in unethical experiments came to light. It wasn't just Guatemala either, he was also involved in the Tuskegee experiments. Now Cutler, the main man in charge of what happened in Guatemala, he reported to Mahoney, was also later involved in Tuskegee like the Surgeon General. He went on to become the Assistant Surgeon General in 1958, and then worked at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health in 1967, and served as their dean until his death in 1969. In 2010, when news of what we did in Guatemala broke out, President Obama issued an apology to Guatemalan President Alvaro Colom. They did some commissions to find out the facts, which is where we get a lot of our information after the initial research and digging done by heroes like Susan Mokotov-Reverby of Wellesley College, who brought all of this to light in 2005 while researching Tuskegee. We really need to credit her for, all of this. And in 2008, Dr. Cutler's role was publicized, and he posthumously lost much of his legacy. The 2011 Commission report concluded that, quote, the Guatemala experiments involved unconscionable basic violations of ethics, even as judged against the researchers' own recognition of the requirements of the medical ethics of the day. End quote. But on the other side, the Guatemalans issued their own report, calling what happened a crime against humanity. And with descriptions like what happened to Berta, I can see why. They argued that racism and discrimination were present throughout the experiments in an explicit and conscious way. An article by Michael Rodriguez and Robert Garcia, titled First, Do No Harm, the U.S. Sexually Transmitted Disease Experiments in Guatemala, outlines this really well. Quote, the wrongful actions by U.S. officials can be characterized by several facts. First, U.S. officials intentionally infected victims with bacteria that caused STDs without informed consent. Second, they have failed to provide victims with treatment or compensation. Finally, they covered up and did not publish or disclose the experiments, including the intentional infections and their failure to provide treatment. End quote. So what can we learn from this? Well, as the 2011 Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues brief notes, quote, the events in Guatemala serve as a cautionary tale of how the quest for scientific knowledge without regard to relevant ethical standards can blind researchers to the humanity of the people they enlist into research. End quote. We have a long and complicated history with Guatemala. From the damage done by the United Fruit Company, to supporting dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, to providing the guns and training used to perpetuate the Guatemalan genocide, to conducting unethical studies on its vulnerable people, there's a lot going on, and not all of that has been dealt with properly. We have to remember that we're all human beings deserving of dignity, and to lose sight of that is to lose sight of our humanity. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelli Beard, and I hope you have enjoyed the story of the Guatemala syphilis experiments. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things, subscribe to AFOUT on YouTube, and check out Nedrick, the musician who created the song you're hearing right now. Links for all of that is in the description. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.
I heard